Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Nathan Hale married Rebecca Hale long before anyone could imagine how their story would end. They were young, hopeful, and determined to build something steady in a world that often felt uncertain. Their love deepened quickly, and before long they welcomed their first child, a daughter named Emily. Just over a year later, their son Noah was born, completing what many in town saw as a picture of quiet happiness. Nathan worked constantly. By day, he repaired engines at a local garage. By night, he took carpentry jobs wherever he could find them. He believed work was protection. As long as he kept his hands busy, his family would be safe. Rebecca stayed home with the children and helped care for her aging parents, who lived in a small trailer set up behind the house. Her father and stepmother struggled with failing health and worsening memory, and Rebecca refused to place them in a facility. Family, to her, was non-negotiable. The Hales lived just outside the town of Cedar Ridge, Missouri. It was rural, quiet, and the kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately. There were more dirt roads than paved ones, and law enforcement coverage was thin. Most nights passed without incident, but beneath the surface, Cedar Ridge had problems. Drug trafficking moved quietly through the area, helped by isolation and lack of oversight. People knew, but few talked. For the Hale family, that darkness felt distant until the night it arrived at their door. On July 18, 1999, a violent storm rolled across the county. Thunder shook windows. Rain fell so hard it flattened fields and flooded ditches. Just after 1 a.m., Deputy Aaron Cole received a call reporting a loud domestic disturbance on County Road 417. Voices raised, possible arguing, nothing more specific. When Deputy Cole arrived, the storm was still raging. Water pooled around his tires as he stepped out of the patrol car. The house sat dark and still. No lights, no movement. He thought he heard shouting at first, but it faded quickly, swallowed by the rain. He knocked. No answer. With no clear signs of immediate danger and visibility worsening by the minute, he made the call to leave. He logged the visit and drove on, unaware that the worst had already happened. Morning brought silence. Rebecca's stepmother, Eleanor, woke early, as she always did. When she tried to open the trailer door, it would not move. Something heavy blocked it from the outside. Confused and irritated, she tried again, then walked around to the back entrance. What she saw there froze her in place. Rebecca lay motionless on the front porch of the main house. Eleanor screamed for her husband, then ran to a neighbor's property for help. Within minutes, sirens cut through the quiet countryside. Sheriff Daniel Mercer arrived first. The porch door was slightly open. A television hummed faintly inside. He stepped into the house and stopped. On the living room floor lay 6-year-old Noah, still in his pajamas, still. The sheriff moved through the home quickly, calling out, hoping against reason that someone would answer. No one did. What he found instead told a story of chaos, furniture overturned, signs of a struggle throughout the house. Outside, Rebecca remained where she had fallen, close enough to safety to almost touch it. 2 people were missing, Nathan Hale and 7-year-old Emily. At first, investigators believed Nathan had taken his daughter and fled. It was the simplest explanation, the one that required the fewest unknowns. But that theory collapsed just 2 days later. Nathan's body was pulled from the Blackwater River less than 10 miles away. The discovery shifted everything. The investigation expanded rapidly, but Cedar Ridge was not equipped for a crime of this magnitude. State authorities were called in. The crime scene was processed again, every inch re-examined, but evidence was limited, damaged by time, weather, and the storm that had masked so much. Autopsies confirmed what no one wanted to accept. Rebecca and Noah had not survived the night. Their deaths were violent, sudden, and personal. The details were kept from the public, but the message was clear. This was not random. This was targeted. Emily remained missing. Search teams scoured the woods, fields, and waterways. Volunteers joined law enforcement. Flyers went up in every neighboring town. For weeks, hope clung stubbornly to the idea that Emily had been taken alive, that she might still be found. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. Cedar Ridge changed. Doors closed earlier. Children were kept inside. Trust eroded quietly. People watched each other more closely. Rumors filled the silence left by unanswered questions. Some said Nathan had been involved in dangerous dealings. Others whispered that he owed money to the wrong people. Names surfaced, disappeared, resurfaced again. One family kept appearing in conversations: the Crowders. Based out of neighboring Pine Hollow, the Crowder family had a reputation that reached far beyond county lines. The patriarch, Leonard Crowder, was known to law enforcement as a drug distributor with a history of violence. His son, Mason Crowder, was often seen with Nathan in the months leading up to the murders. They had been close, until they weren't. Investigators learned that Nathan had fallen into debt, that he may have taken something that did not belong to him. Rebecca had reportedly asked friends for a large loan shortly before the murders, saying she was afraid. But fear does not equal proof. For 2 years, the case stalled. Drieds dried up. Witnesses stayed silent. Emily's disappearance became one of those stories people spoke about in hushed tones, always ending with a shake of the head. Then, on September 3rd, 2001, a hunter made a discovery deep in the Ozark foothills. What he found would finally bring Emily home and reopen a nightmare that Cedar Ridge had tried and failed to forget.
The call came in just after noon on September 3rd, 2001. A hunter moving through a remote stretch of the Ozark foothills had found something he could not explain away. At first, he thought it was animal remains, scattered in a dry creek bed where water only ran during heavy storms. But as he looked closer, the shape was wrong, too deliberate, too human. He backed away and contacted authorities. By late afternoon, the area was sealed off. Yellow tape cut through the trees, and investigators moved carefully, knowing that whatever they were about to confirm would reopen wounds that had never truly healed. When the remains were collected and transported for analysis, few people in Cedar Ridge needed to be told what everyone already suspected. The remains belonged to Emily Hale. The news spread fast. Some people cried openly, others went quiet. For 2 years, hope had lingered in uncomfortable places, in the belief that the child might still be alive somewhere. That hope ended the moment the DNA results came back. There would be no rescue, no reunion, only answers if the town was lucky. The medical examiner could not determine a definitive cause of death. Too much time had passed. Nature had erased details that might have told a clearer story. What remained was the undeniable truth that Emily had not survived long after the night her family was destroyed. With that confirmation, the case shifted. No longer a missing child investigation, it became something else entirely. A full-scale pursuit of whoever had wiped out an entire family and left a town hollowed out in the process. Investigators returned to old leads, re-examining every name that had ever surfaced, and once again, attention settled on the Crowder family. Leonard Crowder had been on law enforcement radar for years. Drug charges, assault allegations, threats that never quite crossed the line into something prosecutors could act on. His son Mason was worse, reckless, volatile, known to brag when he should have stayed quiet. What made the Crowders impossible to ignore was their connection to Nathan Hale. Witnesses confirmed that Nathan and Mason had been involved in illegal dealings together, small at first, then larger. Something had gone wrong near the end, a falling out, a theft according to some, a betrayal according to others. Rebecca Hale's quiet request for money just weeks before her death added weight to the theory. She had told a friend she was scared, that Nathan was in trouble, that people were angry. Still, suspicion was not evidence. Years passed with no arrests. The case remained open but stagnant. Files thickened, detectives rotated in and out. Every time someone new took over, they walked the same path and hit the same wall. Until July 2003. That was when investigators received a phone call that changed everything. The caller was Margaret Crowder, Leonard's former wife. She asked for a meeting. Margaret had been out of Leonard's life for years. Their separation had been ugly, fueled by fear and violence. She had stayed silent through the Hale investigation, even as rumors swirled around her former family. But time has a way of loosening secrets, and guilt has a way of growing louder. Margaret told detectives that Leonard had confessed something to her long ago, not in detail, not all at once, but enough. According to her, on the night of July 18, 1999, Leonard received a phone call from Mason. He left the house without explanation and did not return until early morning. When he came back, he was shaken, different. 2 years later, after Emily's disappearance was still unresolved, Leonard finally told her the truth, or at least his version of it. He said Mason had killed the Hale family. Margaret also revealed something else. Mason, on multiple occasions, claimed it was his father who did it, each blaming the other, each story overlapping just enough to be believable and just different enough to confuse. It was messy, but it was enough to act on. The very next day, Leonard and Mason Crowder were arrested on unrelated charges, nothing tied directly to the Hale case. But investigators knew how pressure worked, and they intended to use it. Leonard was calm during questioning, almost bored. He denied everything, repeated the same phrases, offered nothing. Mason did not hold up as well. Hours turned into days, stories shifted, contradictions piled up. Eventually, Mason cracked. He agreed to talk, but only under one condition: a deal. In exchange for his testimony against his father, Mason would receive a reduced sentence. Prosecutors agreed. What Mason told them was disturbing. He admitted that Nathan Hale had stolen from Leonard. Drugs, money, both. Leonard had been furious. According to Mason, his father demanded payback, not just repayment, revenge. Mason said the plan was simple. He would go to the Hale house and ask Nathan for help, pretending his truck had broken down nearby. Nathan, trusting him, agreed. They left together in Nathan's car. When they reached the location, Leonard was already there. Mason claimed Leonard shot Nathan and disposed of his body in the river. He said he was too shocked to stop it, too scared to run. Then they returned to the house. Mason said he stayed outside at first, that he heard shouting, that when he went inside, he saw his father attacking Rebecca. He claimed Leonard ordered him to leave, that he did. But Mason admitted to seeing Noah on the floor. He said Leonard took Emily alive. What happened next, Mason said, haunted him. He described Emily being held for days. Where, how? His voice reportedly shook as he spoke, though some investigators believed that was an act. According to Mason, Leonard ultimately killed the child to eliminate the last witness. The story was horrifying. It was also not the only version. When Leonard finally spoke, he told investigators something entirely different. He said Mason had acted alone. According to Leonard, Mason had been abusing Emily for months, that Emily told her father, that Nathan planned to go to the sheriff. Leonard claimed Mason panicked, that he lured Nathan out and killed him, that he returned and murdered Rebecca, Noah, that Emily was taken to silence her. Leonard said he helped cover it up, not because he wanted to, but because he feared losing his son to execution. Two stories, same result, different hands holding the weapon. The trial that followed consumed the region. Courtrooms filled, reporters lined hallways. Every detail was dissected. Witnesses contradicted each other. Jailhouse informants came forward with claims of confessions overheard behind bars, some credible, some clearly chasing attention. In 2004, both Leonard and Mason Crowder were convicted. Leonard received the death penalty. Mason was sentenced to 40 years in prison under his plea agreement. For a moment, it felt like closure, but the justice system is rarely that simple. 2 years later, the state Supreme Court overturned Leonard's conviction due to a critical legal error involving witness testimony. A new trial was ordered. This time, Mason refused to testify. The plea deal collapsed. Everything unraveled again, and as the second trial approached, the truth became harder to pin down than ever, because now both men were pointing directly at each other, and the only voices that truly mattered were already gone. By the time Leonard Crowder's retrial began, Cedar Ridge no longer felt like a town chasing justice. It felt like a town exhausted by it. 5 years had passed since the Hale family vanished, nearly 4 since Emily's remains were found. The faces in the courtroom had aged, detectives had changed, even the prosecutors sounded different, more careful, less certain. What had once been a case driven by outrage was now weighed down by doubt. And at the center of it all sat Leonard Crowder, no longer facing the death penalty, no longer the monster everyone thought they understood. The state's case was weaker this time. Mason Crowder's refusal to testify ripped the heart out of the original prosecution strategy. Without his first-hand account, the jury would hear 2 competing narratives without a living witness willing to fully stand behind either one. Prosecutors leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence. Phone records, witness statements placing Leonard and Mason together that night, testimony from Margaret Crowder, whose credibility was attacked relentlessly by the defense. She was portrayed as bitter, unreliable, motivated by resentment rather than truth. The defense focused on one thing above all else: reasonable doubt. They argued that Mason was the architect of everything, that he had manipulated investigators, that he had lied to save himself, that Leonard, while guilty of helping cover up the crimes, was not the killer. And for the first time, that argument landed. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a mixed verdict. Leonard Crowder was convicted of being an accessory after the fact. He was acquitted of capital murder. The sentence was 20 years in prison. For many in Cedar Ridge, it felt like a betrayal. For others, it felt like the only outcome that matched the uncertainty they had lived with for years. Justice, whatever that word meant anymore, had been compromised by time, fear, and missing truth. Mason Crowder, meanwhile, remained behind bars, serving his original sentence. Without his cooperation, prosecutors could not pursue additional charges, and without new evidence, the case could go no further. Officially, the state closed the file. Unofficially, the story refused to stay buried. Over the years, journalists returned to Cedar Ridge, hoping to find something overlooked: a witness who had stayed quiet, a piece of physical evidence misfiled, a confession waiting to be coaxed into daylight. None ever appeared. What did emerge were patterns that unsettled anyone willing to look closely. Mason Crowder's prison behavior raised questions. Guards reported violent outbursts followed by long periods of silence. Fellow inmates claimed he alternated between boasting about the Hale murders and denying involvement entirely. Some said he described details that had never been made public. Others said he was fishing for attention. Leonard Crowder, on the other hand, maintained his innocence until the end. He died in prison in 2018 from natural causes. In his final interview with a local reporter, he said only one thing about the Hale family: they deserved better than the truth they got. It was a strange statement, one that answered nothing, and opened everything. The Hale home was eventually demolished. The land sat empty for years, a scar in the middle of town. New families moved in. Children grew up hearing fragments of the story, never the whole thing. Parents avoided the topic, as if speaking the names might summon something back. Emily Hale became a symbol more than a person. Vigils were held on anniversaries. Her photo appeared in documentaries. Her smile froze in time, untouched by the years that passed without her. But symbols do not replace answers. The biggest question remained unresolved. Who actually killed the Hale family? Investigators privately admitted they did not know. Some believed Mason acted alone and blamed his father when things spiraled beyond his control. Others believed Leonard orchestrated everything and used his son as a shield. A smaller group believed the truth was somewhere in between, a shared crime, a shared silence. What made the case uniquely haunting was how ordinary it all started. No strangers, no masked intruders, just people who knew each other, trusted each other, opened doors without fear. In later years, one retired detective summarized the case with quiet honesty. If we had one honest witness, we'd have had the truth. Just one, but everyone who knew the full story either died or lied. Cedar Ridge never fully recovered. Crime rates stayed low, but trust eroded. Parents became more cautious. Neighbors kept distance. The idea that danger could come from someone familiar settled deep into the town's identity. As for Emily, her grave sits on a small hill overlooking the woods where she was found. Visitors leave toys, flowers, handwritten notes. Some are from people who never met her. Others are from those who still carry guilt for believing she might come home. The case of the Hale family is often listed as solved. Legally, it is. Emotionally, it never will be, because justice depends on certainty, and certainty never came. 2 men went to prison. One died there. One remains incarcerated. But the truth, the real truth, remains locked somewhere no court could reach. And maybe that is the most disturbing part. Not that evil happened, but that it happened quietly among people who shared meals, favors, and trust. And when it was over, the truth fractured into pieces so sharp that no one could hold them without bleeding. Some stories end with closure. This one ends with silence. And in Cedar Ridge, that silence still feels loud. When Elias Crow finally started talking, he did it without apology. No trembling voice, no hesitation. He spoke as if he were reciting weather reports, calmly describing moments that had destroyed dozens of lives. Investigators who sat across from him would later say the most unsettling part was not what he confessed to, but how little it seemed to matter to him. Crow never asked for forgiveness. He never explained himself. He simply told his story, piece by piece, as if it belonged to someone else. He was born on June 12, 1941, in the rural town of Mill Haven, Georgia, a place so small it barely registered on a map. Fewer than 1,000 residents lived there, most scraping by on seasonal work and government aid. Poverty was not an exception in Mill Haven, it was the norm. Elias entered the world unwanted. His mother, a street-level sex worker who drifted between towns, saw him as a burden she could not afford. By his own account, she left him alone for hours at a time. Once she abandoned him near a highway shoulder, hoping someone else would take responsibility. No one did. From an early age, Elias witnessed things children were never meant to see. Men coming and going at night, money exchanged without affection, violence that never made the news. He later described his mother as a ghost who slept during the day and disappeared after dark. There was no warmth in his memories, only observation. Eventually, his grandmother intervened. She brought him north to Ashford, Ohio, a struggling industrial town with fading factories and narrow streets. She gave him a roof and food, but little else. Love was not something Elias ever learned to recognize. In school, he was withdrawn and disruptive. Teachers described him as intelligent but volatile. He struggled academically but showed talent in physical sports, especially boxing. He liked control. He liked winning. He dropped out before finishing junior high. By 16, Elias had discovered something else. Crime made him feel alive. His first arrest was for burglary, then another and another. By his mid-20s, he was cycling through jails across multiple states. Theft, assault, fraud, driving offenses, resisting arrest. The list grew longer each year. Law enforcement knew his name, but only as a nuisance, a repeat offender, a drifter who never stayed long enough to matter. No one saw what he was becoming. In the early 1970s, Elias began traveling constantly. He moved through the South, the Midwest, and the West Coast, living out of cars, cheap motels, and shelters. He learned how to blend in, how to be forgettable, how to disappear the moment attention turned toward him. And during those years, the killings began. His first victim was in South Florida in 1971, a young woman living on the margins, someone few people would go looking for. Elias met her at a neighborhood bar. They talked. She trusted him. That was enough. Later, he would describe the moment without emotion. Investigators noted that he focused on details like the road, the weather, the sound of passing cars, never the person. After that, something clicked into place. Elias discovered a pattern that worked. He targeted women who were isolated, women struggling with addiction, homelessness, or survival work, people society labeled as disposable. He moved from city to city, never staying long, never creating roots. When someone vanished, police departments often didn't connect the cases. Different jurisdictions, different years, different victims with little public attention. Files were opened, stalled, and quietly closed. By the late 1970s, Elias had been arrested dozens of times. Still, no one suspected murder. In 1983, he came close to being exposed. In Pascagoula, Mississippi, a young woman disappeared after being seen with him. He was arrested, questioned, and briefly held, but evidence was thin. Witnesses wavered. A grand jury declined to indict. Elias walked free. Months later, he stood trial again in Florida for another woman's death. Once more, witnesses failed to convince a jury. He left the courtroom smiling. Each escape reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. He moved west. California became his hunting ground. Los Angeles, San Diego, Oakland, cities large enough to swallow the missing without notice. In 1984, a woman survived an attack and identified him. He was arrested and sentenced, but only for assault. The punishment was light, 2.5 years. When he was released in 1987, he went straight back to the streets. For the next 2 decades, Elias Crow drifted through at least a dozen states. Bodies appeared in alleys, vacant lots, fields, and roadside ditches. Most were ruled accidental, undetermined, or never fully investigated. Different names, same ending. Behind bars for minor charges, he shared cells with men who never realized who he was sleeping next to. Outside, he lived as a shadow. No steady job, no permanent address, no digital footprint. Then, in September 2012, everything changed. Police in Louisville, Kentucky picked him up on a routine narcotics charge at a homeless shelter. It was unremarkable, just another arrest in a long list. But this time, a DNA sample was taken. That sample matched 3 unsolved murders from Los Angeles in the late 1980s. For the first time, the past caught up with him. Investigators began pulling old files, cold cases from across the country, similar methods, similar victim profiles. The scope of it was staggering. What they initially thought might be a handful of murders quickly grew into something far darker. When confronted with the evidence, Elias did not resist. He talked. At first, he confessed to 3 murders, then 5, then 10. Each session revealed more, locations investigators had forgotten, names that had never been spoken in decades. His memory was disturbingly precise. What shocked investigators was his attitude. He spoke with pride. He mocked the failures that had allowed him to keep going. He referred to his victims as people no one would miss. That phrase followed the case everywhere. By 2014, Elias Crow stood trial in California for 3 murders tied directly to DNA evidence. Survivors testified. Forensic experts dismantled every denial. The jury needed little time. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But the story did not end there. In prison, Elias began confessing again, this time without prompting. One name led to another. One city led to 5 more. Investigators flew in from across the country, recording hours of interviews. By the time he stopped talking, he claimed responsibility for more than 90 murders across 14 states. Many could never be proven. Some were confirmed. Others remain unresolved, their victims still unnamed. Elias Crow died in custody in December 2020, his health failing after decades of violence. He passed quietly, something he never allowed his victims. But even in death, his shadow remained. Because his story was never just about one man. It was about the gaps he slipped through, the people no one looked for, the systems that failed again and again. And in the next part, the focus shifts away from the killer and toward those he erased, and the investigators who tried, far too late, to give them their names. Once Elias Crow realized the walls around him were permanent, something shifted. Prison stripped away the only thing he valued, movement. With nowhere left to go, he did what he had never done before. He stayed still. And in that stillness, he started talking. At first, investigators thought the confessions were strategic, a man trying to trade stories for attention or comfort. That assumption faded quickly. Crow was not bargaining, he was performing. Each interview felt rehearsed, as if he had been waiting decades for an audience that could not walk away. Detective Aaron Mills was one of the first to sit across from him after the California conviction. Mills later said Crow spoke with a strange precision. Dates, street names, landmarks that no longer existed. He could not always recall names, but he remembered faces, body types, hairstyles, clothing. He remembered how people laughed, how they argued, how they trusted him. That detail terrified the room. The first new confession involved a woman in southern Texas from the mid-1990s. Her case had gone cold within weeks of discovery. No suspects, no witnesses. Crow described where he met her, how long they talked, and where her body was left. When investigators checked the location, the facts lined up. Then came another, and another. Within months, law enforcement agencies from across the country were requesting interviews. Some flew in person, others listened remotely. Cold case units reopened files that had been untouched for decades. Families who had been told there were no answers suddenly received phone calls that changed everything. Not all of those calls brought peace. For some families, Crow's confessions reopened wounds they had worked hard to close. Parents who had buried children without knowing why. Siblings who had spent years wondering if their loved one had simply walked away. Answers arrived late. incomplete, and often unbearable. Crow seemed to understand this, and it did not move him. He often referred to his victims as easy, not because of who they were, but because of how invisible they were to the world around them. He targeted people who lived without safety nets, no fixed address, no reliable documentation, no one calling police the next morning. He learned quickly that disappearance did not always trigger urgency. One investigator noted a pattern that stretched across states and decades. The same cause of death listed repeatedly: strangulation. No weapon, no noise, no evidence left behind if done carefully. Crow did not rush. He waited for moments when no one was watching. As the confessions continued, the number climbed: 30, 40, 50. The media struggled to keep up. Reporters camped outside prisons. Headlines grew darker. The word prolific began appearing alongside his name. Crow seemed amused by the attention, though he never looked directly at cameras. Behind the scenes, investigators faced a different reality. They could not confirm everything he claimed. Some bodies had never been found. Others had been buried as unidentified decades earlier. Records were missing, evidence destroyed, witnesses dead. Truth, they realized, was fragmented. Crow began drawing. During one interview, he asked for paper and pencils. Guards hesitated, then agreed. What he produced stunned everyone. Portraits, faces sketched from memory, women with distinct expressions, some smiling, some wary, some exhausted. The drawings were unsettlingly accurate. The FBI released several to the public, hoping someone would recognize them. Within weeks, tips came in. One sketch matched a woman missing from Ohio since the late 1970s. Another was identified in Louisiana. Each confirmation felt like pulling a name out of darkness. Crow watched the process unfold with interest. He never apologized. When asked why he was helping now, he shrugged. He said it was time, nothing more. In 2018, his confessions accelerated. He admitted to a murder in Kentucky from the early 1980s, then one in Tennessee, then two in Florida. Each admission triggered new indictments, though the sentences no longer mattered. Life without parole had already been imposed. What mattered was the record. For decades, law enforcement had believed multiple killers were responsible for scattered murders across the country. Crow collapsed those theories. What had seemed like unrelated tragedies were suddenly connected by one man who had slipped between jurisdictions unnoticed. The scale of failure was impossible to ignore. In several cases, Crow's confessions cleared the names of others, men who had been suspects for years. In one Florida case, a man serving time for a murder he did not commit was released after Crow provided details only the killer could know. For investigators, that moment was both relief and indictment. Crow's memory remained sharp even as his body declined. Diabetes, heart issues, failing eyesight, none of it dulled his recall. He corrected detectives when they misstated dates. He laughed when they doubted him. He liked being right. One agent later said Crow treated interviews like classroom lectures. He was the teacher, they were the students, and he controlled the lesson. Despite the growing list, many cases remained unsolved. Crow admitted as much. Some names were gone, some locations blurred. Time erased pieces even his memory could not recover. Yet he remembered enough. By mid-2019, authorities acknowledged that Crow was responsible for more murders than any known serial offender in American history. The announcement was careful. Officials emphasized confirmed cases. They avoided sensational language. The public filled in the rest. True crime podcasts exploded. Books were announced. Documentaries followed. Crow's face appeared everywhere, often accompanied by statistics that felt impossible to process. 93. Behind that number were lives that barely registered while they were happening. Investigators who spent time with Crow struggled privately, not because of what he did, but because of what it revealed. How many opportunities had been missed, How many warning signs ignored because the victims did not fit a narrative that demanded urgency? Crow had understood that long before anyone else did. In one interview, he said something that stayed with detectives long after the tape stopped rolling. "People don't go missing," he said. "They get ignored." In late 2020, Crow's health collapsed. Interviews slowed, then stopped entirely. On a quiet December morning, he died in a prison hospital. No dramatic ending, no final confession, just a flat line. But death did not close the case. Even after he was gone, identifications continued. A woman in Tennessee, another in Ohio. Each confirmation came with paperwork, notifications, and quiet moments where families tried to make sense of decades lost. Crow never faced those families. He never heard their anger, their grief, their questions. What remained was a ledger of names slowly being restored. And in the final part, the focus shifts away from the man who took so much and toward the reckoning left behind, the questions no confession could answer, and the lessons no system wanted to admit it had learned too late. When Elias Crow died, there was no sense of closure, no collective exhale. The prison notified authorities, a short statement reached the press, and just like that, the man responsible for decades of devastation was gone. But the damage did not leave with him. In the months after his death, investigators continued working through the wreckage he left behind. Boxes of files remained open, drawings sat pinned to evidence boards, names both known and unknown waited to be confirmed. Crow had stopped talking, but the consequences of his words kept unfolding. For families, the aftermath was complicated. Some finally received answers after decades of silence. A mother in Ohio learned what happened to her daughter who vanished in the late 1970s. A sister in Louisiana discovered that the body buried as Jane Doe was someone she had been searching for since childhood. These answers brought truth, but not relief. Time had already taken so much. Others were left with uncertainty. Crow confessed to murders investigators could never verify. No remains, no records, only fragments of memory from a man who had spent a lifetime lying when it suited him. For those families, hope remained suspended in a painful middle ground. In law enforcement agencies conducted internal reviews, quiet ones, the kind that never make headlines. They studied how Crow moved undetected for so long, how arrests in one state never triggered deeper scrutiny in another, how victim profiles influenced urgency or the lack of it. The conclusions were uncomfortable. Crow had not been clever in a traditional sense. He did not use advanced technology. He did not plan elaborate escapes. His success came from something far simpler. He understood invisibility. He knew exactly who the world would not rush to protect. Many of his victims lived without stable housing. Some struggled with addiction. Others survived through informal economies that rarely intersected with official systems. When they disappeared, there were often no immediate reports, no press conferences, no task forces. Crow exploited that silence. In interviews released after his death, several detectives admitted the same thing. If his victims had come from different circumstances, he would have been stopped early, possibly after the first murder. Instead, patterns were missed because no one was looking for patterns among people society had already decided not to see. This realization reshaped training in several departments. Cold case units began cross-referencing older unsolved deaths more aggressively. Databases improved. Communication between states increased. Progress came, but always with an asterisk. Too late for many. Crow's story also forced a reckoning within true crime media. For years, coverage had centered on killers, their names, their methods, their psychology. In Crow's case, that focus felt hollow, even exploitative. Gradually, the narrative shifted. Documentaries began highlighting victims first, not just their deaths, but their lives, who they were before they became case numbers, artists, mothers, friends.
People who laughed and planned and hoped. People whose absence mattered, even if it had not been treated that way at the time. One journalist wrote that Crow's greatest crime was not the number of lives he took, but how long he proved invisibility could be weaponized. Inside prisons, guards who had interacted with him reflected on his final years. He was quiet, polite, unremarkable. He spent hours drawing, sometimes landscapes, sometimes faces. He never asked for forgiveness, never expressed fear, never acknowledged the pain he caused. Psychologists debated his motivations endlessly. Some pointed to childhood neglect, others to early exposure to violence. None could fully explain the absence of remorse. In the end, explanations felt irrelevant. Causes did not undo consequences. Crow left behind no manifesto, no final statement, no apology. What he left was evidence. Evidence that systems fail when they prioritize some lives over others. Evidence that crimes can hide in plain sight when no one is assigned to care. Evidence that silence can be as dangerous as violence. In 2022, authorities confirmed another identification tied to Crow, a woman found decades earlier, finally given her name back. It was a small headline, easy to miss, but for her family, it meant everything. That became the quiet rhythm of the aftermath, occasional confirmations, occasional updates, each one a reminder that the story was not fully told yet.
Crow's name began fading from headlines. New cases took its place. New monsters filled the public imagination. That, too, was predictable. But for investigators and families, the work continued without cameras. Memorials were held in small community centers, candles lit for people who had never received vigils when they vanished, names read aloud, some for the first time in public. In those moments, the focus returned where it always should have been, on the people. Crow had once said that people did not go missing, they were ignored. In the end, that belief was proven wrong. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably, the ignored were remembered. Their stories were pieced together from fragments, school records, old photographs, recollections from friends who had carried guilt for not knowing what happened. Each story reclaimed space Crow had tried to erase. His grave remains unmarked. That, too, feels fitting. No dates to study, no name to revisit, just absence. The same absence he left behind for so many others. Yet his legacy endures in ways he never intended. In reforms, in awareness, in the refusal to dismiss disappearances based on circumstance, in the growing understanding that every missing person deserves urgency, regardless of how society labels them. The truth is, Crow did not outsmart the system forever. He outlasted its attention, and that is the lesson left behind. Evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers, waits, and moves through the spaces no one bothers to guard. Stopping it requires more than laws and evidence. It requires care. It requires belief. It refusing to look away. Because when we decide some lives matter less, we create room for monsters to thrive. And when we finally decide that no one is disposable, monsters lose the shadows they depend on. That is what remains after Elias Crow. Not closure, not justice in its purest form, but responsibility, and the quiet promise that the forgotten will not stay forgotten forever.